Russian invasion of Ukraine. On February 24, 2022, Russia invaded and occupied parts of Ukraine in a major escalation of the Russo-Ukrainian War, which had begun in 2014. The invasion has resulted in tens of thousands of deaths on both sides and instigated Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II. About 8 million Ukrainians were displaced within their country by June, and more than 8.2 million had fled the country by May 2023. 4 months before the invasion, Russian troops had been concentrating around Ukraine's borders while Russian officials repeatedly denied plans to attack Ukraine. On February 24, 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation to support the Russian-controlled breakaway republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, whose military forces had been fighting Ukraine in the Donbass conflict. He said the goal was to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Putin espoused irredentist views, challenged Ukraine's right to exist, and falsely claimed that Ukraine was governed by neo-Nazis who persecuted the ethnic Russian minority. Minutes later, Russian airstrikes and a ground invasion were launched along a northern front from Belarus towards Kyiv, a northeastern front towards Kharkiv, a southern front from Crimea, and a southeastern front from the Donbass. In response, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky enacted martial law and ordered a general mobilization. Russian troops had retreated from the northern front by April 2022. On the southern and southeastern fronts, Russia captured Kherson in March and then Mariupol in May after a destructive siege. On April 18, Russia launched a renewed Battle of Donbass. Russian forces continued to bomb both military and civilian targets far from the front line, including Ukraine's energy grid, throughout the winter. In late 2022, Ukraine launched counteroffensives in the south and in the east. Soon after, Russia announced the illegal annexation of 4 partly occupied oblasts. In November, Ukraine retook parts of Kherson Oblast, including the city of Kherson. Throughout February 2023, Russia mobilized nearly 200,000 soldiers for a renewed offensive in Donbass. In June 2023, Ukraine launched another counteroffensive in the southeast. The invasion has been met with widespread international condemnation. The United Nations General Assembly passed Resolution ES-11/1 condemning the invasion and demanding a full withdrawal of Russian forces. The International Court of Justice ordered Russia to suspend military operations, and the Council of Europe expelled Russia. Many countries imposed sanctions on Russia, and on its ally Belarus, and provided humanitarian and military aid to Ukraine. Protests occurred around the world. Those in Russia were met with mass arrests and increased media censorship. Over 1,000 companies left Russia and Belarus in response to the invasion. The International Criminal Court, ICC, opened an investigation into possible crimes against humanity, war crimes, abduction of children, and genocide during the invasion, issuing an arrest warrant for Putin in March 2023. Background: after the Soviet Union, USSR, dissolved in 1991, the newly independent republics of Ukraine and Russia maintained ties. Ukraine agreed in 1994 to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and dismantle the nuclear weapons in Ukraine left by the USSR. In return, Russia, the United Kingdom, UK, and the United States, US, agreed in the Budapest Memorandum to uphold the territorial integrity of Ukraine. In 1999, Russia signed the Charter for European Security, which reaffirmed the inherent right of each and every participating state to be free to choose or change its security arrangements, including treaties of alliance. After the Soviet Union dissolved, several former Eastern Bloc countries joined NATO, partly due to regional security threats such as the 1993 Russian constitutional crisis, the war in Abkhazia, 1992–1993, and the First Chechen War, 1994–1996. Russia's President, Vladimir Putin, claimed NATO members had promised in 1990 not to let any Eastern European countries join, but this is disputed. At the 2008 Bucharest summit, Ukraine and Georgia sought to join NATO. The response from NATO members was divided, with Western European countries worried about antagonizing Russia. NATO refused to offer Ukraine and Georgia membership, but Jaap de Hoop Scheffer also issued a statement agreeing that both countries will become members of NATO one day. De Hoop Scheffer stated, "We agreed today that these countries will become members of NATO." Putin strongly opposed the NATO membership bids, and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Russia would do everything it could to prevent their admittance. Ukrainian unrest, Russian activity in Crimea and Donbass. Ukraine, with the annexed Crimea in the south and two Russia-backed separatist republics in Donbass in the east. In November 2013, Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych suddenly cancelled the signing of an association agreement with the European Union (EU), overruling the Ukrainian parliament and instead choosing closer ties with the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union. Russia had put pressure on Ukraine to reject the agreement. This triggered a wave of protests known as Euromaidan, culminating in the removal of Yanukovych in February 2014 and subsequent pro-Russian unrest in eastern and southern parts of Ukraine. Russian soldiers without insignia took control of strategic positions and infrastructure in the Ukrainian territory of Crimea and seized the Crimean parliament. In March, Russia organized a controversial referendum and annexed Crimea. This was followed by the outbreak of the war in Donbass, which began in April 2014 when armed Russia-backed separatists seized Ukrainian government buildings, proclaiming the independent Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. Russian troops were involved in the conflict. The Minsk agreements signed in September 2014 and February 2015 were a bid to stop the fighting, but ceasefires repeatedly failed. A dispute emerged over the role of Russia. Normandy format members France, Germany, and Ukraine saw Minsk as an agreement between Russia and Ukraine, whereas Russia insisted Ukraine should negotiate directly with the two separatist republics. In 2021, Putin refused offers from Zelensky to hold high-level talks, and the Russian government endorsed an article by former President Dmitry Medvedev arguing that it was pointless to deal with Ukraine while it remained a vassal of the United States. The annexation of Crimea led to a new wave of Russian nationalism, with much of the Russian neo-imperial movement aspiring to annex more Ukrainian land to create Novorossiya, New Russia. Analyst Vladimir Soker argued that Putin's 2014 speech after the annexation was a manifesto of Greater Russia irredentism. In July 2021, Putin published an essay titled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, stating that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. In the build-up to the invasion, Putin claimed that Ukraine was created by the Russian Bolsheviks and that it never had a tradition of genuine statehood. American historian Timothy Snyder described Putin's ideas as imperialism. British journalist Edward Lucas described it as historical revisionism. Other observers note that the Russian leadership holds a distorted view of modern Ukraine, as well as its history. Prelude. Russian military build-up around Ukraine as of December 3, 2021. In March and April 2021, Russia began a major military buildup near the Russo-Ukrainian border. A second buildup followed from October 2021 to February 2022, in both Russia and Belarus. Members of the Russian government repeatedly denied having plans to invade or attack Ukraine, including government spokesman Dmitry Peskov on November 28, 2021, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov on January 19, 2022, Russian ambassador to the U.S. Anatoly Antonov on February 20, 2022, and Russian ambassador to the Czech Republic Alexander Smivsky on February 23, 2022. Putin's chief national security advisor, Nikolai Patrushev, is known for his anti-Western views and said that the West was in an undeclared conflict with Russia. Russia's updated national security strategy, published in May 2021, said that Russia may use forceful methods to thwart or avert unfriendly actions that threaten the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Russian Federation. Sources say the decision to invade Ukraine was made by Putin and a small group of war hawks or Siloviki in Putin's inner circle, including Patrushev and Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu. During the second build-up, Russia demanded that NATO sign a treaty barring Ukraine from ever joining NATO, and demanded multinational forces be removed from NATO's Eastern European member states. Russia threatened an unspecified military response if NATO followed an aggressive line. These demands were widely seen as non-viable. Eastern European states had willingly joined NATO for security reasons, and their governments sought protection from Russian irredentism. A treaty to prevent Ukraine joining would go against NATO's open-door policy, despite NATO's unenthusiastic response to Ukrainian requests to join. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg replied that Russia has no say on whether Ukraine joins, and that Russia has no right to establish a sphere of influence to try to control their neighbors. NATO's official policy is that it does not seek confrontation, and NATO and Russia had cooperated until Russia annexed Crimea. French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz both made efforts to prevent war in February 2022. Macron met Putin but failed to convince him not to go ahead with the invasion. Scholz warned Putin that heavy sanctions would be imposed should he invade Ukraine. Scholz, in trying to negotiate a settlement, also told Zelensky to declare neutrality and renounce aspirations to join NATO. However, Zelensky said Putin could not be trusted to uphold such a settlement. Putin's invasion announcement. On February 21, Putin made an address announcing that Russia recognized the Russian-controlled territories of Ukraine as independent states, the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. The following day, Russia announced it was sending troops into the territories as peacekeepers, while the Federation Council of Russia authorized the use of military force abroad. On February 24, before 5 a.m. Kiev time, Putin made another address announcing that Russia was launching a special military operation, which Business Insider described as effectively declare war on Ukraine. He said the purpose of the operation was to protect the people of the Donbass, in the Russian-controlled breakaway republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. He falsely claimed they had been facing humiliation and genocide perpetrated by the Kiev regime. Putin also falsely claimed that Ukraine's government were neo-Nazis under Western control, that Ukraine was developing nuclear weapons, and that NATO was building up military infrastructure in Ukraine to threaten Russia. He said Russia sought the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. Putin said he had no plans to occupy Ukraine and supported the right of the Ukrainian people to self-determination. Within minutes of Putin's announcement, Russian missiles struck targets throughout Ukraine, and Russian troops invaded from the north, east and south. Later, an alleged report from Russia's Federal Security Service, FSB, was leaked, claiming that the intelligence agency had not been aware of Putin's plan to invade Ukraine. Invasion. The invasion began at dawn on February 24, with infantry divisions and armored and air support in eastern Ukraine, and dozens of missile attacks across Ukraine, which reached as far west as Lviv. The first fighting took place in Luhansk Oblast near Milo village on the border with Russia at 3:40 a.m. Kiev time. The main infantry and tank attacks were launched in 4 spearhead incursions, creating a northern front launched towards Kiev from Belarus, a southern front from Crimea, a southeastern front from the Russian-controlled Donbass, and an eastern front launched from Russia towards Kharkiv and Sumy. Russian vehicles were marked with a white Z military symbol, a non-Cyrillic letter, believed to be a measure to prevent friendly fire. When the invasion began, Zelensky declared martial law in Ukraine. The same evening, he ordered a general mobilization of all Ukrainian males between 18 and 60 years old, prohibiting them from leaving the country. Wagner Group mercenaries and Chechen forces reportedly made several attempts to assassinate Zelensky. The Ukrainian government said these efforts were thwarted by anti-war officials in Russia's FSB, who shared intelligence of the plans. The Russian invasion was unexpectedly met by fierce Ukrainian resistance. In Kiev, Russia failed to take the city as its attacks were repulsed at the suburbs during the battles of Irpin, Hostomel and Bucha. The Russian army tried to encircle the capital, but Ukrainian forces managed to hold ground. Ukraine utilized Western arms to great effectiveness, including the Javelin anti-tank missile and the Stinger anti-aircraft missile, thinning Russian supply lines and stalling the offensive. The defense of the Ukrainian capital was under the command of Colonel General Alexander Syrsky. On March 9, a column of Russian tanks and armored vehicles was ambushed in Brovary, suffered heavy losses and was forced to retreat. The Russian army adopted siege tactics on the Western Front around the key cities of Chernihiv, Sumy and Kharkiv, but failed to capture them due to stiff resistance and logistical setbacks. On the Southern Front, Russian forces captured the major city of Kherson on March 2. In Mykolaiv Oblast, they advanced as far as Voznesensk but were repelled south of Mykolaiv. On March 25, the Russian Defense Ministry stated that the first stage of the military operation in Ukraine was generally complete, that the Ukrainian military forces had suffered serious losses, and that the Russian military would now concentrate on the liberation of Donbass. The first stage of the invasion was conducted on 4 fronts, including one towards western Kiev from Belarus by the Russian Eastern Military District, comprising the 29th, 35th, and 36th Combined Arms Armies. A second axis, deployed towards eastern Kiev from Russia by the Central Military District, Northeastern Front, comprised the 41st Combined Arms Army and the 2nd Guards Combined Arms Army. A third axis was deployed towards Kharkiv by the Western Military District, Eastern Front, with the 1st Guards Tank Army and 20th Combined Arms Army. A fourth, Southern Front originating in occupied Crimea and Russia's Rostov Oblast with an eastern axis towards Odessa and a western area of operations toward Mariupol was opened by the Southern Military District, including the 58th, 49th, and 8th Combined Arms Army, the latter also commanding the 1st and 2nd Army Corps of the Russian separatist forces in Donbass. By April 7, Russian troops deployed to the northern front by the Russian Eastern Military District pulled back from the Kiev offensive, apparently to resupply and redeploy to the Donbass region to reinforce the renewed invasion of southeastern Ukraine. The northeastern front, including the Central Military District, was similarly withdrawn for resupply and redeployment to southeastern Ukraine. On April 18, retired Lieutenant General Douglas Lute, the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, reported in a PBS NewsHour interview that Russia had repositioned its troops to initiate a new assault on eastern Ukraine, which would be limited to Russia's original deployment of 150,000 to 190,000 troops for the invasion, though the troops were being well supplied from adequate weapon stockpiles in Russia. For Lute, this contrasted sharply with the vast size of the Ukrainian conscription of all male Ukrainian citizens between 16 and 60 years of age, but without adequate weapons in Ukraine's highly limited stockpiles of weapons. On April 26, delegates of the U.S. and 40 allied nations met at Ramstein Air Base in Germany to discuss forming a coalition to provide economic support and military supplies and refitting to Ukraine. Following Putin's Victory Day speech in early May, U.S. Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines said no short-term resolution to the invasion should be expected. Ukraine's reliance on Western-supplied equipment constrained operational effectiveness, as supplying countries feared that Ukraine would use Western-made material to strike targets in Russia. Military experts disagreed on the future of the conflict. Some suggested that Ukraine should trade territory for peace, while others believed that Ukraine could maintain its resistance thanks to the Russian losses. By May 30, disparities between Russian and Ukrainian artillery were apparent, with Ukrainian artillery being vastly outgunned by range and number. In response to U.S. President Joe Biden's indication that enhanced artillery would be provided to Ukraine, Putin indicated that Russia would expand its invasion front to include new cities in Ukraine and in apparent retribution ordered a missile strike against Kyiv on June 6 after not directly attacking the city for several weeks. On June 10, 2022, Vadim Skibitsky, deputy head of Ukraine's military intelligence, stated during the Severodonetsk campaign that the front lines were where the future of the invasion would be decided. "This is an artillery war now, and we are losing in terms of artillery. Everything now depends on what the West gives us." Ukraine has 1 artillery piece to 10 to 15 Russian artillery pieces. Our Western partners have given us about 10% of what they have. On June 29, Reuters reported that Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines, updating U.S. intelligence assessment of the Russian invasion, said that U.S. intelligence agencies agree that the invasion will continue for an extended period of time. In short, the picture remains pretty grim and Russia's attitude toward the West is hardening. On July 5, BBC reported that extensive destruction by the Russian invasion would cause immense financial damage to Ukraine's reconstruction economy, stating, "Ukraine needs $750 billion for a recovery plan and Russian oligarchs should contribute to the cost," Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal has told a reconstruction conference in Switzerland. Initial invasion of Ukraine, February 24, April 7. The invasion began on February 24, launched out of Belarus to target Kyiv, and from the northeast against the city of Kharkiv. The southeastern front was conducted as 2 separate spearheads, from Crimea and the southeast against Luhansk and Donetsk, 78-79. Kyiv and Northern Front. Russian efforts to capture Kyiv included a probative spearhead on February 24, from Belarus south along the west bank of the Dnipro River, apparently to encircle the city from the west, supported by 2 separate axes of attack from Russia along the east bank of the Dnipro, the western at Chernihiv, and the eastern at Sumy. These were likely intended to encircle Kyiv from the northeast and east. Russia apparently tried to seize Kyiv quickly, with Spetsnaz infiltrating into the city supported by airborne operations and a rapid mechanized advance from the north, but was unsuccessful. Around this time, the United States contacted President Zelensky and offered assistance with helping him flee the country, should the Russian army attempt to kidnap or kill him upon the planned seizure of Kyiv. According to a senior American intelligence official with direct knowledge of the conversation, Zelensky reportedly said in response to the request to evacuate, "The fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride." The Washington Post, which described the quote as one of the most cited lines of the Russian invasion, was not entirely sure of the comment's accuracy. Reporter Glenn Kessler said it came from a single source, but on the surface it appears to be a good one. Russian forces advancing on Kyiv from Belarus gained control of the ghost towns of Chernobyl and Pripyat. Russian airborne forces attempted to seize 2 key airfields near Kyiv, launching an airborne assault on Antonov Airport, and a similar landing at Vasilkiv, near Vasilkiv Air Base, on February 26. By early March, Russian advances along the west side of the Dnipro were limited by Ukrainian defenses. As of March 5, a large Russian convoy, reportedly 64 kilometers, 40 miles, long, had made little progress toward Kyiv. The London-based think tank Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, assessed Russian advances from the north and east as stalled. Advances from Chernihiv largely halted as a siege began there. Russian forces continued to advance on Kyiv from the northwest, capturing Bucha, Hostomel, and Vorzel by March 5, though Irpin remained contested as of March 9. By March 11, the lengthy convoy had largely dispersed and taken cover. On March 16, Ukrainian forces began a counteroffensive to repel Russian forces. Unable to achieve a quick victory in Kyiv, Russian forces switched their strategy to indiscriminate bombing and siege warfare. On March 25, a Ukrainian counteroffensive retook several towns to the east and west of Kyiv, including Makariv. Russian troops in the Bucha area retreated north at the end of March. Ukrainian forces entered the city on April 1. Ukraine said it had recaptured the entire region around Kiev, including Irpin, Bucha, and Hostomel, and uncovered evidence of war crimes in Bucha. On April 6, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that the Russian retraction, resupply, and redeployment of their troops from the Kiev area should be interpreted as an expansion of Putin's plans for Ukraine, by redeploying and concentrating his forces on eastern Ukraine. Kiev was generally left free from attack apart from isolated missile strikes. One did occur while UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres was visiting Kiev on April 28 to discuss with Zelensky the survivors of the siege of Mariupol. One person was killed and several were injured in the attack. Northeastern Front. Russian forces advanced into Chernihiv Oblast on February 24 and besieged its administrative capital. The next day Russian forces attacked and captured Konotop. A separate advance into Sumy Oblast the same day attacked the city of Sumy, just 35 kilometers, 22 miles, from the Russo-Ukrainian border. The advance bogged down in urban fighting, and Ukrainian forces successfully held the city, claiming more than 100 Russian armored vehicles were destroyed and dozens of soldiers were captured. Russian forces also attacked Okturka, deploying thermobaric weapons. On March 4, Frederick Kagan wrote that the Sumy Axis was then the most successful and dangerous Russian avenue of advance on Kiev, and commented that the geography favored mechanized advances as the terrain is flat and sparsely populated, offering few good defensive positions. Traveling along highways, Russian forces reached Brovary, an eastern suburb of Kiev, on March 4. The Pentagon confirmed on April 6 that the Russian army had left Chernihiv Oblast, but Sumy Oblast remained contested. On April 7, the governor of Sumy Oblast said that Russian troops were gone, but left behind rigged explosives and other hazards. Southern Front. On February 24, Russian forces took control of the North Crimean Canal. Troops used explosives to destroy the dam that was blocking the river, allowing Crimea to obtain water from the Dnieper, which had been cut off since 2014. On February 26, the siege of Mariupol began as the attack moved east, linking to separatist-held Donbass. En route, Russian forces entered Berdyansk and captured it. On March 1, Russian forces attacked Melitopol and nearby cities. On February 25, Russian units from the DPR moves on Mariupol and were defeated near Pavlopol. By evening, the Russian Navy reportedly began an amphibious assault on the coast of the Sea of Azov 70 kilometers, 43 miles, west of Mariupol. A U.S. defense official said that Russian forces might be deploying thousands of Marines from this beachhead. The Russian 22nd Army Corps approached the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant on February 26 and besieged Enerhodar in order to assume control. A fire began, but the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, stated that essential equipment was undamaged. Despite the fires, the plant recorded no radiation leaks. A third Russian attack group from Crimea moved northwest and captured bridges over the Dnieper. On March 2, Russian troops won a battle at Kherson. This was the first major city to fall to Russian forces in the invasion. Russian troops moved on Mykolaiv, attacking it 2 days later. They were repelled by Ukrainian forces. On March 2, Ukrainian forces initiated a counteroffensive on Holyuka, controlled by the DPR since 2014. After renewed missile attacks on March 14 in Mariupol, the Ukrainian government said more than 2,500 had died. By March 18, Mariupol was completely encircled and fighting reached the city center, hampering efforts to evacuate civilians. On March 20, an art school sheltering around 400 people was destroyed by Russian bombs. The Russians demanded surrender, and the Ukrainians refused. On March 24, Russian forces entered central Mariupol. On March 27, Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister Ol Stefanishina said that more than 85% of the whole town is destroyed. Putin told Emmanuel Macron in a phone call on March 29 that the bombardment of Mariupol would only end when the Ukrainians surrendered. On April 1, Russian troops refused safe passage into Mariupol to 50 buses sent by the United Nations to evacuate civilians, as peace talks continued in Istanbul. On April 3, following the retreat of Russian forces from Kiev, Russia expanded its attack on southern Ukraine further west, with bombardment and strikes against Odessa, Mykolaiv, and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Eastern Front. In the east, Russian troops attempted to capture Kharkiv, less than 35 kilometers, 22 miles, from the Russian border, and met strong Ukrainian resistance. On February 25, the Milarovo air base was attacked by Ukrainian military forces with OTR-21 Tochka missiles, which according to Ukrainian officials, destroyed several Russian Air Force planes and started a fire. On February 28, missile attacks killed several people in Kharkiv. On March 1, Denis Pushilin, head of the DPR, announced that DPR forces had almost completely surrounded the city of Volnovakha. On March 2, Russian forces were repelled from Severodonetsk during an attack against the city. Izium was reportedly captured by Russian forces on March 17, although fighting continued. On March 25, the Russian Defense Ministry said it would seek to occupy major cities in eastern Ukraine. On March 31, the Ukrainian military confirmed Izium was under Russian control, and PBS News reported renewed shelling and missile attacks in Kharkiv, as bad or worse than before, as peace talks with Russia were to resume in Istanbul. Amid the heightened Russian shelling of Kharkiv on March 31, Russia reported a helicopter strike against an oil supply depot approximately 35 kilometers, 22 miles, north of the border in Belgorod, and accused Ukraine of the attack. Ukraine denied responsibility. By April 7, the renewed massing of Russian invasion troops and tank divisions around the towns of Izium, Sloviansk, and Kramatorsk prompted Ukrainian government officials to advise the remaining residents near the eastern border of Ukraine to evacuate to western Ukraine within 2 to 3 days, given the absence of arms and munitions previously promised to Ukraine by then. Southeastern Front, April 8, September 5. By April 17, Russian progress on the southeastern front appeared to be impeded by opposing Ukrainian forces in the large, heavily fortified Azovstal steel mill and surrounding area in Mariupol. On April 19, the New York Times confirmed that Russia had launched a renewed invasion front referred to as an eastern assault across a 480-kilometer (300 miles) front extending from Kharkiv to Donetsk and Luhansk, with simultaneous missile attacks again directed at Kiev in the north and Lviv in western Ukraine. As of April 30, a NATO official described Russian advances as uneven and minor. An anonymous U.S. defense official called the Russian offensive very tepid, minimal at best, and anemic. In June 2022, the chief spokesman for the Russian Ministry of Defense Igor Konashenkov revealed that Russian troops were divided between the Army Groups Center commanded by Colonel General Alexander Lapin and South commanded by Army General Sergei Surovikin. On July 20, Lavrov announced that Russia would respond to the increased military aid being received by Ukraine from abroad as justifying the expansion of its special military operation to include objectives in both the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions. Russian ground forces started recruiting volunteer battalions from the regions in June 2022 to create a new Third Army Corps within the Western Military District, with a planned strength estimated at 15,500 to 60,000 personnel. Its units were deployed to the front around the time of Ukraine's September 9 Kharkiv Oblast counteroffensive, in time to join the Russian retreat, leaving behind tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and personnel carriers. The Third Army Corps melted away according to Forbes, having little or no impact on the battlefield along with other irregular forces. Fall of Mariupol. On April 13, Russian forces intensified their attack on the Azovstal iron and steel works in Mariupol, and the Ukrainian defense forces that remained there. By April 17, Russian forces had surrounded the factory. Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal said that the Ukrainian soldiers had vowed to ignore the renewed ultimatum to surrender and to fight to the last soul. On April 20, Putin said that the siege of Mariupol could be considered tactically complete, since the 500 Ukrainian troops entrenched in bunkers within the Azovstal ironworks and estimated 1,000 Ukrainian civilians were completely sealed off from any type of relief in their siege. After consecutive meetings with Putin and Zelensky, UN Secretary-General Guterres on April 28 said he would attempt to organize an emergency evacuation of survivors from Azovstal in accordance with assurances he had received from Putin on his visit to the Kremlin. On April 30, Russian troops allowed civilians to leave under UN protection. By May 3, after allowing approximately 100 Ukrainian civilians to depart from the Azovstal steel factory, Russian troops renewed non-stop bombardment of the steel factory. On May 6, the Telegraph reported that Russia had used thermobaric bombs against the remaining Ukrainian soldiers, who had lost contact with the Kiev government. In his last communications, Zelensky had authorized the commander of the besieged steel factory to surrender as necessary under the pressure of increased Russian attacks. On May 7, the Associated Press reported that all civilians were evacuated from the Azovstal steel works at the end of the three-day ceasefire. After the last civilians evacuated from the Azovstal bunkers, nearly 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers remained barricaded there, with 700 injured. They were able to communicate a plea for a military corridor to evacuate, as they expected summary execution if they surrendered to the Russians. Reports of dissent within the Ukrainian troops at Azovstal were reported by Ukrainskaya Pravda on May 8, indicating that the commander of the Ukrainian Marines assigned to defend the Azovstal bunkers made an unauthorized acquisition of tanks, munitions, and personnel, broke out from the position there and fled. The remaining soldiers spoke of a weakened defensive position in Azovstal as a result, which allowed progress to advancing Russian lines of attack. Ilya Somolyenko, deputy commander of the remaining Ukrainian troops barricaded at Azovstal, said, "We are basically here dead men. Most of us know this, and it's why we fight so fearlessly." On May 16, the Ukrainian General Staff announced that the Mariupol garrison had fulfilled its combat mission and that final evacuations from the Azovstal steel factory had begun. The military said that 264 service members were evacuated to Olenivka under Russian control, while 53 of them who were seriously injured had been taken to a hospital in Novozovsk, also controlled by Russian forces. Following the evacuation of Ukrainian personnel from Azovstal, Russian and DPR forces fully controlled all areas of Mariupol. The end of the battle also brought an end to the siege of Mariupol. Russia Press Secretary Dmitry Peskov said Russian President Vladimir Putin had guaranteed that the fighters who surrendered would be treated in accordance with international standards, while Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said in an address that the work of bringing the boys home continues, and this work needs delicacy and time. Some prominent Russian lawmakers called on the government to deny prisoner exchanges for members of the Azov regiment. Fall of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. A Russian missile attack on Kramatorsk railway station in the city of Kramatorsk took place on April 8, reportedly killing at least 52 and injuring 87 to 300. On April 11, Zelensky said that Ukraine expected a major new Russian offensive in the east. American officials said that Russia had withdrawn or been repulsed elsewhere in Ukraine, and therefore was preparing a retraction, resupply, and redeployment of infantry and tank divisions to the southeastern Ukraine front. Military satellites photographed extensive Russian convoys of infantry and mechanized units deploying south from Kharkiv to Izium on April 11, apparently part of the planned Russian redeployment of its northeastern troops to the southeastern front of the invasion. On April 18, with Mariupol almost entirely overtaken by Russian forces, the Ukrainian government announced that the second phase of the reinforced invasion of the Donetsk, Luhansk and Kharkiv regions had intensified with expanded invasion forces occupying of the Donbass. On May 22, the BBC reported that after the fall of Mariupol, Russia had intensified offensives in Luhansk and Donetsk while concentrating missile attacks and intense artillery fire on Severodonetsk, the largest city under Ukrainian control in Luhansk province. On May 23, Russian forces were reported entering the city of Lyman, fully capturing the city by May 26. Ukrainian forces were reported leaving Svyatohorsk. By May 24, Russian forces captured the city of Svitlodarsk. On May 30, Reuters reported that Russian troops had breached the outskirts of Severodonetsk. By June 2, the Washington Post reported that Severodonetsk was on the brink of capitulation to Russian occupation with over 80% of the city in the hands of Russian troops. On June 3, Ukrainian forces reportedly began a counterattack in Severodonetsk. By June 4, Ukrainian government sources claimed 20% or more of the city had been recaptured. On June 12, it was reported that possibly as many as 800 Ukrainian civilians, as per Ukrainian estimates, and 300 to 400 soldiers, as per Russian sources, were besieged at the Azot chemical factory in Severodonetsk. With the Ukrainian defenses of Severodonetsk faltering, Russian invasion troops began intensifying their attack upon the neighboring city of Lysychansk as their next target city in the invasion. On June 20 it was reported that Russian troops continued to tighten their grip on Severodonetsk by capturing surrounding villages and hamlets surrounding the city, most recently the village of Metelkine. On June 24, CNN reported that, amid continuing scorched earth tactics being applied by advancing Russian troops, Ukraine's armed forces were ordered to evacuate the Severodonetsk. Several hundred civilians taking refuge in the Azot chemical plant were left behind in the withdrawal, with some comparing their plight to that of the civilians at the Azovstal steel works in Mariupol in May. On July 3, CBS announced that the Russian Defense Ministry claimed that the city of Lysychansk had been captured and occupied by Russian forces. On July 4, The Guardian reported that after the fall of the Luhansk Oblast, that Russian invasion troops would continue their invasion into the adjacent Donetsk Oblast to attack the cities of Sloviansk and Bakhmut. Kharkiv Front. On April 14, Ukrainian troops reportedly blew up a bridge between Kharkiv and Izium used by Russian forces to redeploy troops to Izium, impeding the Russian convoy. On May 5, David Axe, writing for Forbes, stated that the Ukrainian army had concentrated its 4th and 17th Tank Brigades and the 95th Air Assault Brigade around Izium for possible rearguard action against the deployed Russian troops in the area. Axe added that the other major concentration of Ukraine's forces around Kharkiv included the 92nd and 93rd Mechanized Brigades, which could similarly be deployed for rearguard action against Russian troops around Kharkiv or link up with Ukrainian troops contemporaneously being deployed around Izium. On May 13, BBC reported that Russian troops in Kharkiv were being retracted and redeployed to other fronts in Ukraine following the advances of Ukrainian troops into surrounding cities and Kharkiv itself, which included the destruction of strategic pontoon bridges built by Russian troops to cross over the Seversky Donets River and previously used for rapid tank deployment in the region. Kherson-Mykolaiv Front. Missile attacks and bombardment of the key cities of Mykolaiv and Odessa continued as the second phase of the invasion began. On April 22, Russia's Brigadier General Rustam Minikayev in a defense ministry meeting said that Russia planned to extend its Mykolaiv-Odessa front after the siege of Mariupol further west to include the breakaway region of Transnistria on the Ukrainian border with Moldova. The Ministry of Defense of Ukraine described this intention as imperialism, saying that it contradicted previous Russian claims that it did not have territorial ambitions in Ukraine and that the statement was an admission that the goal of the second phase of the war is not victory over the mythical Nazis, but simply the occupation of eastern and southern Ukraine. Georgy Gotev, writing for Reuters on April 22, noted that occupying Ukraine from Odessa to Transnistria would transform it into a landlocked nation without any practical access to the Black Sea. On April 24, Russia resumed its missile strikes on Odessa, destroying military facilities and causing 24 civilian casualties. On April 27, Ukrainian sources indicated that explosions had destroyed 2 Russian broadcast towers in Transnistria, primarily used to rebroadcast Russian television programming. At the end of April, Russia renewed missile attacks on runways in Odessa, destroying some of them. During the week of May 10, Ukrainian troops began to take military action to dislodge Russian forces installing themselves on Snake Island in the Black Sea, approximately 200 kilometers, 120 miles, from Odessa. On June 30, 2022, Russia announced that it had withdrawn troops from the island after objectives were completed. On July 23, CNBC reported a Russian missile strike on Ukrainian port Odessa, stating that the action was swiftly condemned by world leaders, a dramatic revelation amid a recently UN and Turkish brokered deal that secured a sea corridor for grains and other foodstuff exports. On July 31, CNN reported significant intensification of the rocket attacks and bombing of Mykolaiv by Russians, also killing Ukrainian grain tycoon Alexei Vadaturskyi in the city during the bombing. Zaporizhzhia front. Russian forces continued to fire missiles and drop bombs on the key cities of Dnipro and Zaporizhzhia. On April 10, Russian missiles destroyed the Dnipro International Airport. On May 2, the UN reportedly evacuated about 100 survivors from the siege at Mariupol with the cooperation of Russian troops, to the village of Bezymen near Donetsk, from whence they were to move to Zaporizhzhia. On June 28, Reuters reported that a Russian missile attack was launched upon the city of Kremenchuk northwest or Zaporizhzhia, detonating in a public mall and causing at least 18 deaths, while drawing condemnation from France's Emmanuel Macron, among other world leaders, who spoke of it as being a war crime. On July 7, it was reported that after the Russians captured the nuclear plant at Zaporizhzhia earlier in the invasion, they installed heavy artillery and mobile missile launchers between the separate reactor walls of the nuclear installation, using it as a shield against possible Ukrainian counterattack. A counterattack against the installed Russian artillery sites would not be possible without the risk of radiation fallout in case of near misses. On August 19, Russia agreed to allow IAEA inspectors access to the Zaporizhzhia plant from Ukrainian-held territory, after a phone call between Macron and Putin. A temporary ceasefire around the plant still needed to be agreed for the inspection. Russia reported that 12 attacks with over 50 artillery shells explosions had been recorded at the plant and the staff town of Enerhodar by August 18. Also on August 19, Tobias Ellwood, chair of the UK's Defence Select Committee, said that any deliberate damage to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant that could cause radiation leaks would be a breach of Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, according to which an attack on a member state of NATO is an attack on all of them. The next day, United States Congressman Adam Kinzinger said that any radiation leak would kill people in NATO countries, which would be an automatic activation of Article 5. Shelling hit coal ash dumps at the neighboring coal-fired power station on August 23, and ash was on fire by August 25. The 750 kV transmission line to the Dniprovska substation, which was the only one of the 4 750 kV transmission lines that had not yet been damaged and cut by military action, passes over the ash dumps. At 12:12 p.m. on August 25, the line cut off due to the fire below, disconnecting the plant and its 2 operating reactors from the national grid for the first time since it started operating in 1985. In response, Reactor 5's backup generators and coolant pumps started up, and Reactor 6 reduced generation. Incoming power was still available via the 330 kV line to the substation at the coal-fired station, so the diesel generators were not essential for cooling reactor cores and spent fuel pools. The 750 kV line and Reactor 6 resumed operation at 12:29 p.m., but the line was cut by fire again 2 hours later. The line, but not the reactors, resumed operation again later that day. On August 26, one reactor restarted in the afternoon and another in the evening, resuming electricity supplies to the grid. On August 29, 2022, an IAEA team led by Rafael Grossi went to investigate the plant. Liddy Everard and Massimo Apparo were also in the leadership team. No leaks had been reported at the plant before their arrival, but shelling had occurred days before. Russian annexations and occupation losses, September 6, November 11, 2022. On September 6, 2022, Ukrainian forces launched a surprise counteroffensive in the Kharkiv region, beginning near Balaklia. This counteroffensive was led by General Syrskyi. By September 12, an emboldened Kiev launched a counteroffensive in the area surrounding Kharkiv with sufficient success for Russia to publicly admit to losing key positions in the area. The New York Times reported on September 12 that the success of the counteroffensive dented the image of a mighty Putin and led to encouraging the government in Kiev to seek more arms from the West to sustain its counteroffensive in Kharkiv and surrounding areas. On September 21, 2022, Vladimir Putin announced a partial mobilization. He also said that his country will use all means to defend itself. Later that day, Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu stated that 300,000 reservists would be called on a compulsory basis. Mikhailo Podolyak, the advisor to the President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky, said that the decision was predictable and was an attempt to justify Russia's failures. British Foreign Office Minister Gillian Keegan called the situation an escalation, while former Mongolian President Tsakia Elbegdorj accused Russia of using Russian Mongols as cannon fodder. Russian annexation of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia oblasts. In late September 2022, Russian installed officials in Ukraine organized referendums on annexation of occupied territories of Ukraine, including the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic in Russian-occupied Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts of Ukraine, as well as the Russian-appointed military administrations of Kherson Oblast and Zaporizhia Oblast. Denounced by Ukraine's government and its allies as sham elections, the official results showed overwhelming majorities in favor of annexation. On September 30, 2022, Vladimir Putin announced the annexation of Ukraine's Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia regions in an address to both houses of the Russian parliament. Ukraine, the United States, the European Union and the United Nations all denounced the annexation as illegal. Zaporizhia Front. On September 3, 2022, an IAEA delegation visited the nuclear power plant at Zaporizhia, and on September 6 a report was published documenting damage and threats to the plant's security caused by external shelling and the presence of occupying troops in the plant. On September 11, at 3:14 a.m., the sixth and final reactor was disconnected from the grid, completely stopping the plant. The statement from Energodom said that preparations are underway for its cooling and transfer to a cold state. In the early hours of October 9, 2022, the Russian armed forces carried out an airstrike on a residential building in the city of Zaporizhia, killing 13 civilians and injuring 89 others. Kherson counteroffensive. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, participating in re-raising the Ukrainian flag in Kherson a few days after the city's liberation. On August 29, Zelensky advisedly vowed the start of a full-scale counteroffensive in the southeast. He first announced a counteroffensive to retake Russian-occupied territory in the south, concentrating on the Kherson-Mykolaiv region, a claim that was corroborated by the Ukrainian parliament as well as Operational Command South. On September 4, Zelensky announced the liberation of 2 unnamed villages in Kherson Oblast and 1 in Donetsk Oblast. Ukrainian authorities released a photo showing the raising of the Ukrainian flag in Vysokopilia by Ukrainian forces. Ukrainian attacks also continued along the southern front line, though reports about territorial changes were largely unverifiable. On September 12, Zelensky said that Ukrainian forces had retaken a total of 6,000 square kilometers, 2,300 square miles, from Russia, in both the south and the east. The BBC stated that it could not verify these claims. In October, Ukrainian forces pushed further south towards the city of Kherson, taking control of 1,170 square kilometers, 450 square miles, of territory, with fighting extending to Dudchany. On November 9, Defense Minister Shoigu ordered Russian forces to leave part of Kherson Oblast, including the city of Kherson, and move to the eastern bank of the Dnieper. On November 11, Ukrainian troops entered Kherson, as Russia completed its withdrawal. This meant that Russian forces no longer had a foothold on the west, right, bank of the Dnieper. Kharkiv counteroffensive. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces launched another surprise counteroffensive on September 6 in the Kharkiv region, beginning near Balaklia. This counteroffensive was led by General Syrsky. By September 7, Ukrainian forces had advanced some 20 kilometers, 12 miles, into Russian-occupied territory and claimed to have recaptured approximately 400 square kilometers, 150 square miles. Russian commentators said this was likely due to the relocation of Russian forces to Kherson in response to the Ukrainian offensive there. On September 8, Ukrainian forces captured Balaklia and advanced to within 15 kilometers, 9.3 miles, of Kupiansk. Military analysts said Ukrainian forces appeared to be moving towards Kupiansk, a major railway hub, with the aim of cutting off the Russian forces at Izium from the north. On September 9, the Russian Occupation Administration of Kharkiv Oblast announced it would evacuate the civilian populations of Izium, Kupiansk, and Veliky Berlik. The Institute for the Study of War, ISW, said it believed Kupiansk would likely fall in the next 72 hours, 299, while Russian reserve units were sent to the area by both road and helicopter. On the morning of September 10, photos emerged claiming to depict Ukrainian troops raising the Ukrainian flag in the center of Kupiansk, and the ISW said Ukrainian forces had captured approximately 2,500 square kilometers, 970 square miles, by effectively exploiting their breakthrough. Later in the day, Reuters reported that Russian positions in northeast Ukraine had collapsed in the face of the Ukrainian assault, with Russian forces forced to withdraw from their base at Izium after being cut off by the capture of Kupiansk. By September 15, an assessment by UK's Ministry of Defence confirmed that Russia had either lost or withdrawn from almost all of their positions west of the Oskil River. The retreating units had also abandoned various high-value military assets. The offensive continued pushing east, and by October 2, Ukrainian armed forces had liberated another key city in the Second Battle of Lyman. Winter stalemate, attrition campaign and military surge, November 12, 2022 to June 7, 2023. After the end of the twin Ukrainian counteroffensives, the fighting shifted to a semi-deadlock during the winter, with heavy casualties but reduced motion of the front line. Russia launched a self-proclaimed winter offensive in eastern Ukraine, but the campaign ended in disappointment for Moscow, with the offensive stalling and gains being limited. Analysts variously blamed the failure on Russia's lack of trained men, and supply problems with artillery ammunition, among other problems. Near the end of May, Mark Giliotti assessed that after Russia's abortive and ill-conceived winter offensive, which squandered its opportunity to consolidate its forces, Ukraine is in a relatively strong position. On February 7, the New York Times reported that Russians had newly mobilized nearly 200,000 soldiers to participate in the offensive in the Donbass, against Ukraine troops already wearied by previous fighting. The Russian private military company Wagner Group took on greater prominence in the war, leading grinding advances in Bakhmut with tens of thousands of recruits from prison battalions taking part in near-suicidal assaults on Ukrainian positions. In late January 2023, fighting intensified in the southern Zaporizhia region, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. In nearby southern parts of Donetsk Oblast, intense, three-week Russian assault near the coal mining town of Volodar was called the largest tank battle of the war to date, and ended in disaster for Russian forces, with Ukrainian commanders and the British Ministry of Defense saying that Russia had lost at least 130 tanks and armored personnel carriers during the battle, and a whole Russian brigade was effectively annihilated, respectively. Battle of Bakhmut. Following defeat in Kherson and Kharkiv, Russian and Wagner forces have focused on taking the city of Bakhmut and breaking the half-year-long stalemate that has prevailed there since the start of the war. Russian forces have sought to encircle the city, attacking from the north via Soledar. After taking heavy casualties, Russian and Wagner forces took control of Soledar on January 16, 2023. By early February 2023, Bakhmut was facing attacks from north, south, and east, with the sole Ukrainian supply lines coming from Chasiv Yar to the west. On March 3, 2023, Ukrainian soldiers destroyed two key bridges, creating the possibility for a controlled fighting withdrawal from eastern sectors of Bakhmut. On March 4, Bakhmut's deputy mayor told news services that there was street fighting in the city. On March 7, despite the city's near encirclement, the New York Times reported that Ukrainian commanders were requesting permission from Kiev to continue fighting against the Russians in Bakhmut. On March 26, Wagner Group forces claimed to have fully captured the tactically significant Azov factory in Bakhmut. Appearing before the House Committee on Armed Services on March 29, General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, reported that, for about the last 21 days, the Russia have not made any progress whatsoever in and around Bakhmut. Milley described the severe casualties being inflicted upon the Russian forces there as a slaughterfest. By the beginning of May, the ISW assessed that Ukraine controlled only 1.89 square kilometers of the city, less than 5%. On May 18, 2023, the New York Times reported that Ukrainian forces launched a local counteroffensive, taking back swaths of territory to the north and south of Bakhmut over the course of a few days. 2023 counteroffensive, June 8, 2023, present. In June 2023, Ukrainian forces gradually launched a series of counteroffensives on multiple fronts, including Donetsk Oblast, Zaporizhia Oblast, and others. On June 8, 2023, it was reported that counteroffensive efforts were focused near settlements such as Orikhiv, Tokmak, and Bakhmut. However, the counteroffensive operations have so far faced stiff resistance from Russia, with the American think tank ISW labeling the Russian defensive effort as having an uncharacteristic degree of coherency. By June 12, Ukraine reported its fastest advance in 7 months, claiming to have liberated several villages and advanced a total of 6.5 kilometers. Russian military bloggers also reported that Ukraine had taken Blahodan, Makarivka, and Neskiny, and were continuing to push southward. Missile attacks and aerial warfare. Aerial warfare began on the first day of the invasion. By September, the Ukrainian Air Force was still at 80% of its pre-war strength and had shot down about 55 Russian warplanes. By late December, 173 Ukrainian aircraft and UAVs were confirmed to have been shot down, whereas Russia had lost 171 aircraft. With the beginning of the invasion, dozens of missile attacks were recorded across both eastern Ukraine and western Ukraine. Dozens of missile strikes across Ukraine also reached as far west as Lviv. Starting in mid-October, Russian forces launched massive missile strikes against Ukrainian infrastructure, intending to knock out energy facilities throughout the country. By late November, hundreds of civilians had been killed and wounded by the attacks, and millions of civilians had been left without power due to rolling blackouts. In December, several attacks on Dyagilevo and Engels air bases in western Russia were allegedly carried out by drones launched from Ukraine, causing 10 casualties in addition to heavily damaging two Tu-95 aircraft. Attacks in Crimea. On July 31, 2022, Russian Navy Day commemorations were cancelled after a drone attack reportedly wounded several people at the Russian Black Sea Fleet headquarters in Sevastopol. On August 9, 2022, there were large explosions reported at Sakei Air Base in western Crimea. Satellite imagery showed that at least 8 aircraft were damaged or destroyed. The cause of the explosions is unknown, but may have been long-range missiles, sabotage by special forces, or an accident. Zaluzhnyi claimed on September 7 that it had been a Ukrainian missile attack. The base is located near the town of Novofedorivka, which is popular with tourists. Queues to leave the area formed at the Crimean Bridge after the explosions. A week later, there were explosions and a fire at an arms depot near Dzenkoy in northeastern Crimea, which Russia blamed on sabotage. A railway line and power station were also damaged. According to the Russian regional head, Sergei Aksionov, 2,000 people were evacuated from the area. On August 18, explosions were reported at Belbek Air Base, north of Sevastopol. Russian attacks against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. On the morning of October 8, 2022, the Kerch Bridge, which links occupied Crimea with Russia, partially collapsed due to an explosion. Russia later blamed Ukraine for the blast and launched retaliatory missile strikes against Ukrainian civilian areas. Russia has continued to carry out waves of strikes on Ukrainian electrical and water systems since. On October 16, The Washington Post reported that Iran was planning to supply Russia with both drones and missiles. On November 21, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry said that according to reports in the Israeli press, Israel might respond by transferring short-range and medium-range missiles to Ukraine. On October 18, 2022, the U.S. State Department accused Iran of violating UN Resolution 2231 by selling Shahed-131 and Shahed-136 drones to Russia, agreeing with similar assessments by France and the United Kingdom. Iran denied sending arms for use in the Ukraine war. On October 22, France, Britain and Germany formally called for an investigation by the UN team responsible for UNSCR 2231. On November 1, CNN reported that Iran was preparing to send ballistic missiles and other weapons to Russia for use in Ukraine. On November 21, CNN reported that an intelligence assessment had concluded that Iran planned to help Russia begin production of Iran-designed drones in Russia. The country making the intelligence assessment was not named. By December 29, the Biden administration stated through diplomatic entreaties that Iran would need to curtail its supply of drones to Russia being used in its invasion of Ukraine, under the alternative that the United States would be compelled to redouble its supply of anti-drone missile intercept technology to Ukraine in order to nullify Iranian drone weaponry currently being deployed against Ukraine. On November 15, 2022, Russia fired 85 missiles at the Ukrainian power grid, causing major power outages in Kyiv and neighboring regions. A missile, initially reported to be Russian and later claimed to be Russian-made, crossed into Poland, killing 2 people in Przywadzą, which led to the top leaders of Poland holding an emergency meeting. The next day, U.S. President Joe Biden stated that the missile that struck Polish territory was unlikely to have been fired from Russia. On December 31, Putin ordered an extensive and large missile and drone attack upon Kyiv, accompanied by his declaration that he intends to increase the diplomatic and military ante of the war against Ukraine for all Russians to now be a sacred duty to our ancestors and descendants. On March 10, 2023, The New York Times reported that Russia has converted its massive missile attacks of Ukraine towards the preferred use of hypersonic missile systems, which are more effective in evading conventional Ukrainian anti-missile defenses, which were proving useful against conventional, non-hypersonic Russian missile systems. Naval blockade and engagements. Ukraine lies on the Black Sea, which has ocean access only through the Turkish-held Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits. On February 28, Turkey invoked the 1936 Montreux Convention and sealed off the straits to Russian warships not registered to Black Sea home bases and not returning to their ports of origin. This prevented the passage of 4 Russian naval vessels through the Turkish straits in late February. On February 24, the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine announced that an attack on Snake Island by Russian Navy ships had begun. The guided missile cruiser Moskva and patrol boat Vasily Bykov bombarded the island with their deck guns. When the Russian warship identified itself and instructed the Ukrainian soldiers stationed on the island to surrender, the response was Russian warship, "Go fuck yourself." After the bombardment, a detachment of Russian soldiers landed and took control of Snake Island. Russia stated on February 26 that U.S. drones supplied intelligence to the Ukrainian Navy to help target Russian warships in the Black Sea, which the U.S. denied. By March 3, the Ukrainian frigate Hetman Sahaydachny, the flagship of the Ukrainian Navy, was scuttled in Mykolaiv to prevent its capture by Russian forces. On March 14, the Russian source RT reported that the Russian armed forces had captured about a dozen Ukrainian ships in Berdyansk, including the Polnikny-class landing ship Yuri Olafarenko. On March 24, Ukrainian officials said that a Russian landing ship docked in Berdyansk, initially reported to be the Orsk and then its sister ship, the Saratov, was destroyed by a Ukrainian rocket attack. In March 2022, the UN International Maritime Organization (IMO) sought to create a safe sea corridor for commercial vessels to leave Ukrainian ports. On March 27, Russia established a sea corridor 80 miles (130 kilometers) long and 3 miles (4.8 kilometers) wide through its maritime exclusion zone, for the transit of merchant vessels from the edge of Ukrainian territorial waters southeast of Odessa. Ukraine closed its ports at Marsek Level 3, with sea mines laid in port approaches, until the end to hostilities. The Russian cruiser Moskva, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, was, according to Ukrainian sources and a U.S. senior official, hit on April 13 by 2 Ukrainian Neptune anti-ship cruise missiles, setting the ship on fire. The Russian Defense Ministry confirmed the warship had suffered serious damage due to a munition explosion caused by a fire, and said that its entire crew had been evacuated. Pentagon spokesman John Kirby reported on April 14 that satellite images showed that the Russian warship had suffered a sizable explosion on board but was heading to the east for expected repairs and refitting in Sevastopol. Later on the same day, the Russian Ministry of Defense stated that Moskva had sunk while under tow in rough weather. On April 15, Reuters reported that Russia launched an apparent retaliatory missile strike against the missile factory Luch Design Bureau in Kiev, where the Neptune missiles used in the Moskva attack were manufactured and designed. On May 5, a U.S. official confirmed that the U.S. gave a range of intelligence, including real-time battlefield targeting intelligence, to assist in the sinking of the Moskva. In early May, Ukrainian forces launched counterattacks on Snake Island. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed to have repelled these counterattacks. Ukraine released footage of a Russian Cerna-class landing craft located in the Black Sea being destroyed near Snake Island by a Ukrainian drone. The same day, a pair of Ukrainian Su-27 conducted a high-speed, low-level bombing run on Russian-occupied Snake Island. The attack was captured on film by a Baykar Bayraktar TB2 drone. On June 1, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov asserted that Ukraine's policy of mining its own harbors to impede Russian maritime aggression had contributed to the food export crisis, stating that, if Kiev solves the problem of demining ports, the Russian Navy will ensure the unimpeded passage of ships with grain to the Mediterranean Sea. On June 30, 2022, Russia announced that it had withdrawn troops from the island in a gesture of goodwill. The withdrawal was later officially confirmed by Ukraine. Command. The Supreme Commanders-in-Chief are the heads of state of the respective governments, President Vladimir Putin of Russia and President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine. Putin has reportedly meddled in operational decisions, bypassing senior commanders and giving orders directly to brigade commanders. Ukraine's top military commander responsible for defense in the war is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Valery Zaluzhnyi. On Zaluzhnyi's leadership of the Ukrainian military, Milley has opined, he has emerged as the military mind his country needed. His leadership enabled the Ukrainian armed forces to adapt quickly with battlefield initiative against the Russians. Russia started its invasion with no overall commander, starting its so-called special military operation without expectation of serious resistance or a real war. Commanders of 4 military districts were each responsible for their own offensive campaign. After initial setbacks, commander of the Russian Southern Military District Alexander Dvornikov was placed in overall command on April 8, 2022, while maintaining responsibility for his own campaign. Russian forces improved their focus on the protection of supply lines by advancing slowly and methodically. They also benefited from the centralized command under Dvornikov. However, continued failures to achieve military objectives led to multiple changes in overall command, all while continuing to fulfill the responsibilities of other posts, with commander of the Eastern Military District Gennady Izydko, Eastern Military District, May 26, October 8, commander of the Southern Grouping of Forces Sergei Surovikin, October 8, January 11, and Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Armed Forces Valery Gerasimov, from January 11, 2023, successively having the role added to their responsibilities. Russian President Putin may have personally rotated leaders through the top position to avoid responsibility for failures and prevent any one commander from claiming victory, like the tensions between Stalin and Zhukov after World War II. Russia has suffered a remarkably large number of casualties in the officer ranks, including quite a few generals. Nuclear threats. For days into the invasion, President Putin placed Russia's nuclear forces on high alert, raising fears that Russia could use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine, or a wider escalation of the conflict could occur. During April, Putin and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov made a number of threats alluding to the use of nuclear weapons against Ukraine and the countries supporting Ukraine. On April 14, CIA Director William Burns said that potential desperation in the face of defeat could encourage President Putin to use tactical nuclear weapons. In response to Russia's disregard of safety precautions during its occupation of the disabled former nuclear power plant at Chernobyl and its firing of missiles in the vicinity of the active Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, on April 26 President Zelensky called for an international discussion on regulating Russia's use of nuclear resources, stating, "No one in the world can feel safe knowing how many nuclear facilities, nuclear weapons and related technologies the Russian state has." If Russia has forgotten what Chernobyl is, it means that global control over Russia's nuclear facilities and nuclear technology is needed. In August, shelling around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant developed into a crisis, prompting an emergency inspection by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Ukraine has described the crisis as an act of nuclear terrorism by Russia. On September 19, CNBC reported that Biden's response to Russian uncertainties about its lack of combat success in its invasion, stating, President Joe Biden warned of a consequential response from the U.S. if Russian President Vladimir Putin were to use nuclear or other non-conventional weapons. Asked what he would say to Putin if he was considering such action, Biden replied, Don't. Following his statement made on September 19, Biden appeared before the United Nations on September 21 and continued his criticism of Putin's nuclear saber-rattling, stating that Putin was overt, reckless, and irresponsible. A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. In January 2023, Graham Allison, writing for Time, presented a 7-point summary of Putin's hypothetical intention to deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. In March 2023, Putin announced plans to install Russian tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. Ukrainian resistance. Ukrainian civilians resisted the Russian invasion, volunteering for territorial defense units, making Molotov cocktails, donating food, building barriers such as Czech hedgehogs, and helping to transport refugees. Responding to a call from Ukraine's transportation agency, Ukravtodor, civilians dismantled or altered road signs, constructed makeshift barriers, and blocked roadways. Social media reports showed spontaneous street protests against Russian forces in occupied settlements, often evolving into verbal altercations and physical standoffs with Russian troops. By the beginning of April, Ukrainian civilians began to organize as guerrillas, mostly in the wooded north and east of the country. The Ukrainian military announced plans to launch a large-scale guerrilla campaign to complement its conventional defense against the Russian invasion. People physically blocked Russian military vehicles, sometimes forcing them to retreat. The Russian soldiers' response to unarmed civilian resistance varied from reluctance to engage the protesters to firing into the air or directly into crowds. There have been mass detentions of Ukrainian protesters, and Ukrainian media has reported forced disappearances, mock executions, hostage-taking, extrajudicial killings, and sexual violence perpetrated by the Russian military. To facilitate Ukrainian attacks, civilians reported Russian military positions via a Telegram chatbot and Dia, a Ukrainian government app previously used by citizens to upload official identity and medical documents. In response, Russian forces began destroying mobile phone network equipment, searching door-to-door for smartphones and computers, and in at least one case killing a civilian found with pictures of Russian tanks. As of May 21, 2022, Zelensky indicated that Ukraine had 700,000 service members on active duty combating the Russian invasion. Throughout 2022, Ukraine withdrew soldiers and military equipment deployed to United Nations peacekeeping missions, such as MONUSCO in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, back to Ukraine. International aspects. Reactions. The invasion received widespread international condemnation from governments and intergovernmental organizations. On March 2, 2022 and on February 23, 2023, 141 member states of the UN General Assembly voted for Russia to immediately withdraw, while only 5 and 7 member states, respectively, including Russia, voted against the resolutions. Political reactions to the invasion included new sanctions imposed on Russia, which triggered widespread economic effects on the Russian and world economies. The European Union and other Western governments financed and delivered humanitarian and military aid to Ukraine. The bloc also implemented various economic sanctions, including a ban on Russian aircraft using EU airspace, a ban on certain Russian banks from using the SWIFT international payment system, and a ban on certain Russian media outlets. Reactions to the invasion have varied considerably across a broad spectrum of concerns, including public response, media responses, peace efforts, and the examination of the legal implications of the invasion. The invasion received widespread public condemnation internationally, while in some countries, certain sectors expressed sympathy or outright support for Russia due in part to distrust of U.S. foreign policy. Protests and demonstrations were held worldwide, including some in Russia and parts of Ukraine occupied by Russia. Calls for a boycott of Russian goods spread on social media platforms, while hackers attacked Russian websites, particularly those operated by the Russian government. Anti-Russian sentiment against Russians living abroad surged after the invasion. In March 2022, Russian President Putin introduced prison sentences of up to 15 years for publishing fake news about Russian military operations, intended to suppress any criticism related to the war. By October 2022, 3 countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, had declared Russia a terrorist state. The invasion prompted Ukraine, Finland and Sweden to officially apply for NATO membership. By April 2023, Finland was accepted as a member of NATO. Foreign involvement. Although Ukraine is not a member of NATO and does not have any military alliance with the United States or with any NATO nation, the Kiel Institute tracked $155.9 billion from 41 countries and European Union institutions in financial, humanitarian, and military aid to Ukraine from January 24, 2022 to February 24, 2023. NATO is coordinating and assisting member states in providing billions of dollars in military equipment and financial aid to Ukraine. The United States has provided the most military assistance, having committed over $29.3 billion from February 24, 2022 to February 3, 2023. Many NATO allies, including Germany, have reversed past policies against providing offensive military aid in order to support Ukraine. The European Union for the first time in its history supplied lethal arms and has provided €3.1 billion to Ukraine. Bulgaria, a major manufacturer of Soviet-pattern weapons, has covertly supplied more than €2 billion worth of arms and ammunition to Ukraine, including a third of the ammunition needed by the Ukrainian military in the critical early phase of the invasion. Bulgaria also provides fuel supplies and has, at times, covered 40% of the fuel needs of the Ukrainian armed forces. Foreign involvement in the invasion has been worldwide and extensive, with support ranging from foreign military sales and aid, foreign military involvement, foreign sanctions and ramifications, and including foreign condemnation and protest. The U.S. has adopted a policy of no boots on the ground in Ukraine. Western countries and others imposed limited sanctions on Russia when it recognized the separatist people's republics as independent nations. When the attack began, many other countries applied sanctions intended to cripple the Russian economy. The sanctions targeted individuals, banks, businesses, monetary exchanges, bank transfers, exports, and imports. Belarus has allowed its territory to be used by Russia to stage part of the invasion, as well as be used for launching Russian missiles into Ukraine. In March 2023, Politico reported that Chinese state-owned weapons manufacturer Norinco shipped assault rifles, drone parts, and body armor to Russia between June and December 2022, with some of the shipments going through via third countries including Turkey and the United Arab Emirates. According to the United States, Chinese ammunition has been used on battlefields in Ukraine. In May 2023, the EU identified that Chinese and the UAE firms were supplying weapon components to Russia. In June 2023, U.S. military intel suggested Iranians provided UAV production material to Russians. International arrest warrants. The International Criminal Court (ICC) opened an investigation into possible crimes against humanity, war crimes, abduction of children, and genocide during the invasion. On March 17, 2023, the ICC issued a warrant for Putin's arrest, alleging that Putin held criminal responsibility in the illegal deportation and transfer of children from Ukraine to Russia during the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It was the first time that the ICC had issued an arrest warrant for the head of state of one of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, the world's 5 principal nuclear powers. Casualties. Combat deaths can be inferred from a variety of sources, including satellite photos and videos of military action. Both Russian and Ukrainian sources are widely believed, weasel words, to inflate casualty numbers in opposing forces, while downplaying their own losses for the sake of morale. RAND researcher Dara Massakat said that Russia underreports its own losses to a greater degree than Ukraine. Russian news outlets have largely stopped reporting the Russian death toll. Russia and Ukraine admitted suffering significant and considerable losses, respectively. BBC News reported in April 2022 that Ukrainian claims of Russian deaths included the living injured. Agence France Presse and independent conflict monitors could not verify Russian and Ukrainian claims of enemy losses and suspected that they were inflated. The number of civilian and military deaths is impossible to determine precisely in the fog of war. On October 12, 2022, the independent Russian media project iStories reported that more than 90,000 Russian soldiers had been killed, been seriously wounded, or gone missing in Ukraine, citing sources close to the Kremlin. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, estimates the number of civilian casualties to be considerably higher than the figure the United Nations has been able to certify. On June 16, 2022, the Ukrainian Minister of Defense told CNN that he believed that tens of thousands of Ukrainians had died, adding that he hoped that the true death toll was below 100,000. In the destroyed city of Mariupol alone, Ukrainian officials believe at least 25,000 have been killed, but investigations of morgue records indicate many more, and some bodies remain uncollected. By April 16, 2023, The New York Times reported that documents in the 2023 Pentagon document leaks estimated 189,500 to 223,000 Russian casualties, compared to 124,500 to 131,000 Ukrainian casualties. Prisoners of war. Official statistics and estimates of prisoners of war, POW, have varied. In the initial stages of the invasion, on February 24, Oksana Markarova, Ukraine's ambassador to the U.S., said that a platoon of the 74th Guards Motor Rifle Brigade from Kemerovo Oblast surrendered, saying they were unaware that they had been brought to Ukraine and tasked with killing Ukrainians. Russia claimed to have captured 572 Ukrainian soldiers by March 2, 2022, while Ukraine claimed 562 Russian soldiers were being held as prisoners as of March 20, with 10 previously reported released in a prisoner exchange for 5 Ukrainian soldiers and the mayor of Melitopol. A report by The Independent on June 9 cited an intelligence report estimating that more than 5,600 Ukrainian soldiers had been captured, while the number of Russian servicemen being held as prisoners had fallen to 550, from 900 in April, following several prisoner exchanges. In contrast, Ukrayinska Pravda claimed 1,000 Russian soldiers were being held as prisoners as of June 20. The first large prisoner exchange took place on March 24, 2022, when 10 Russian and 10 Ukrainian soldiers, as well as 11 Russian and 19 Ukrainian civilian sailors, were exchanged. On April 1, 86 Ukrainian servicemen were exchanged for an unknown number of Russian troops. On August 25, 2022, research conducted by the Humanitarian Research Lab of the Yale School of Public Health and the Conflict Observatory was published, which reported the identification of some 21 filtration camps in and around Russian-controlled Donetsk Oblast, run by Russian and Russian allied forces and used for Ukrainian civilians, POWs, and other personnel. These camps were allegedly used for 4 main purposes: as registration points, as camps and other holding facilities for those awaiting registration, as interrogation centers, and as correctional colonies, i.e., prisons. At Olenivka prison, one of the identified camps, the disturbed earth seen in imagery was said by researchers to be consistent with graves. Kaveh Kashnud, a professor at the Yale School of Public Health, said, "Incommunicado detention of civilians is more than a violation of international humanitarian law, it represents a threat to the public health of those currently in the custody of Russia and its proxies." The conditions of confinement documented in this report allegedly include insufficient sanitation, shortages of food and water, cramped conditions, and reported acts consistent with torture. In March 2023, UN Human Rights Commissioner Volker Turk reported that more than 90% of the Ukrainian POWs interviewed by his office, which could only include those who were released from Russia, said in Russia they were tortured or ill-treated, notably in penitentiary facilities, including through so-called, it is an awful phrase, welcoming beatings on their arrival, as well as frequent acts of torture throughout detention. In April, several videos started circulating on different websites purportedly showing Russian soldiers beheading Ukrainian soldiers. Impacts. Humanitarian impact. The humanitarian impact of the invasion has been extensive and has included negative impacts on international food supplies and the 2022 food crises. The invasion has also had a negative impact upon the cultural heritage of Ukraine, with over 500 Ukrainian cultural heritage sites, including cultural centers, theaters, museums, and churches, having been impacted by Russian aggression, and Ukraine's Minister of Culture calling it cultural genocide. The deliberate destruction and looting of Ukrainian cultural heritage sites in this way is considered a war crime. The Russian attacks on civilians, causing mass civilian casualties and displacement, have been characterized as genocide and democide. Refugee crisis. The war caused the largest refugee and humanitarian crisis within Europe since the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s. The UN described it as the fastest growing such crisis since World War II. As Russia built up military forces along the Ukrainian border, many neighboring governments and aid organizations prepared for a mass displacement event in the weeks before the invasion. In December 2021, the Ukrainian defense minister estimated that an invasion could force 3 to 5 million people to flee their homes. In the first week of the invasion, the UN reported over 1 million refugees had fled Ukraine. This subsequently rose to over 8 million by January 31, 2023. On May 20, NPR reported that, following a significant influx of foreign military equipment into Ukraine, a significant number of refugees are seeking to return to regions of Ukraine which are relatively isolated from the invasion front in southeastern Ukraine. However, by May 3, another 8 million people were displaced inside Ukraine. Most refugees were women, children, the elderly, or people with disabilities. Most male Ukrainian nationals aged 18 to 60 were denied exit from Ukraine as part of mandatory conscription, unless they were responsible for the financial support of 3 or more children, single fathers, or were the parent/guardian of children with disabilities. Many Ukrainian men, including teenagers, opted to remain in Ukraine voluntarily in order to join the resistance. Regarding destinations, according to the UN High Commission for Refugees, as of May 13, there were 3,315,711 refugees in Poland, 901,696 in Romania, 594,664 in Hungary, 461,742 in Moldova, 415,402 in Slovakia, and 27,308 in Belarus, while Russia reported it had received over 800,104 refugees. As of March 23, over 300,000 refugees had arrived in the Czech Republic. Turkey has been another significant destination, registering more than 58,000 Ukrainian refugees as of March 22, and more than 58,000 as of April 25. The EU invoked the Temporary Protection Directive for the first time in its history, granting Ukrainian refugees the right to live and work in the EU for up to 3 years. Britain has accepted 146,379 refugees, as well as extending the ability to remain in the UK for 3 years with broadly similar entitlements as the EU, 3 years residency and access to state welfare and services. According to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, Russia has engaged in massive deportation of over 1.3 million Ukrainian civilians, potentially constituting crimes against humanity. The OSCE and Ukraine have accused Russia of forcibly moving civilians to filtration camps in Russian-held territory, and then into Russia. Ukrainian sources have compared this policy to Soviet-era population transfers and Russian actions in the Chechen War of Independence. For instance, as of April 8, Russia claimed to have evacuated about 121,000 Mariupol residents to Russia. Also, on October 19, Russia announced the forced deportation of 60,000 civilians from areas around the line of contact in Kherson Oblast. RIA Novosti and Ukrainian officials said that thousands were dispatched to various centers in cities in Russia and Russian-occupied Ukraine, from which people were sent to economically depressed regions of Russia. In April, Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council Secretary Alexei Danilov said Russia planned to build concentration camps for Ukrainians in western Siberia, and that it likely planned to force prisoners to build new cities in Siberia. Environmental impact. An explosion due to the shelling of a tank filled with nitric acid during the Battle of Severodonetsk, May 31, 2022. Based on a preliminary assessment, the war has inflicted $51 billion in environmental damage in both territories. According to a report by the Yale School of the Environment, some 687,000 tons of petrochemicals have burned as a result of shelling, while nearly 1,600 tons of pollutants have leaked into bodies of water. Hazardous chemicals have contaminated around 70 acres of soil, and likely made agricultural activities temporarily impossible. International observers and the Ukrainian government have described this as ecocide. According to Netherlands-based peace organization PAX, Russia's deliberate targeting of industrial and energy infrastructure has caused severe pollution, and the use of explosive weapons has left millions of tons of contaminated debris in cities and towns. In early June 2023, the Kakhovka Dam, under Russian occupation, was damaged, causing flooding and triggering warnings of an ecological disaster. Peace efforts. Peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine took place on February 28, March 3, and March 7, 2022, in an undisclosed location in the Gomel region on the Belarus-Ukraine border, with further talks held on March 10 in Turkey prior to a fourth round of negotiations which began on March 14. The Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba stated on July 13 that peace talks are frozen for the time being. On July 19, former Russian president and current deputy head of the Russian Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, said, "Russia will achieve all its goals. There will be peace, on our terms." Putin's spokesperson Dmitry Peskov and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that any peace plan can only proceed from Ukraine's recognition of Russia's sovereignty over the regions it annexed from Ukraine in September 2022. By December 29, following the Russian-declared annexation of multiple Ukrainian oblasts, hopes for Ukrainian peace talks with Russia dimmed significantly, with Russia taking a hardline position that the full Russian occupation of the four oblasts would be non-negotiable under any circumstances. In addition, Zelensky announced that Ukraine would not hold peace talks with Russia while Putin was president and signed a decree to ban such talks. In January 2023, Putin's spokesperson Peskov said that there is currently no prospect for diplomatic means of settling the situation around Ukraine. In May 2023, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said peace negotiations to end the Russo-Ukrainian war were not possible at this moment, saying it was clear that Russia and Ukraine are completely absorbed in this war and are convinced that they can win. In June 2023, Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov said that the peace plans presented by China, Brazil and Indonesia are attempts at mediation on behalf of Russia, saying that they all currently want to be mediators on Russia's side. "That's why this sort of mediation currently doesn't fit for us at all, because they aren't impartial." He said that Ukraine is willing to accept China as a mediator for peace talks between Russia and Ukraine only if Beijing could convince Russia to withdraw from all the territories it had occupied.